She was laughing when she said it. That's the part I keep coming back to. Not a nervous laugh, not an awkward laugh. A real one. Like I'd walked into a party and told a joke she'd been waiting all evening to hear. "I'm sorry," she said, though she wasn't. "Your name isn't showing up on our list." I looked at my son. He was standing 2 feet behind her, holding a glass of champagne, studying the floor. I had driven 40 minutes to get there. I put on the blue dress I bought specifically for that night. I'd had my hair done that morning, something I hadn't done in years, because I wanted to look like someone who belonged in a room like that. Crystal chandeliers, white orchids on every surface, a string quartet setting up in the corner. I knew every single vendor in that room. I had spoken to them on the phone. I had handed over my credit card information, one by one, over the course of 8 months. And my name wasn't on the list. "There must be a mistake," I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt. "My daughter-in-law, Renata, my son's fiancée, the woman who had picked out those orchids and approved that string quartet and chosen the champagne flutes that probably cost more per stem than my weekly grocery budget, tilted her head at me like I was a child who didn't understand how things worked. "This is just the rehearsal dinner," she said. "Family and wedding party only." "I'm his mother," I said. She smiled the way people smile when they've already won. "I know. But the list is the list." My son said nothing. I stood there for a moment. The woman at the check-in table was looking at her clipboard. The man in the suit behind her was looking at his shoes. I could feel other guests slowing down as they approached, catching the edges of what was happening. I turned around and walked back to my car. I didn't cry until I was out of the parking lot. And even then, I'm not sure what I was crying about, the humiliation or the fact that my son had watched it happen and hadn't said a single word. Let me tell you a little about my son, because you need to understand who he was before you understand what happened next. His name is Lyle. He's 44 years old. He has his father's eyes and my stubbornness, though he wouldn't admit to either. His father passed when Lyle was 19, a heart attack, sudden, no warning. And after that, it was just the two of us for a long time. I worked as an office manager for a dental practice for 22 years. We weren't rich, we were careful. I put Lyle through college. Not all of it. He had a partial scholarship, but enough that he didn't graduate with debt. When he was 26 and trying to start his landscaping business, I co-signed a loan I couldn't really afford to co-sign. When his first marriage fell apart and he needed a place to stay, he lived in my spare room for 14 months. I didn't charge him rent. I made him dinner most nights because I could tell he wasn't eating. He met Renata 3 years after the divorce. She was polished in a way Lyle had never been drawn to before. A corporate job, a condo downtown, clothes that looked expensive because they were. I tried to like her. I genuinely tried. The first time she came to my house for Sunday dinner, she looked around my kitchen the way people look at things they're deciding whether to comment on. She didn't comment, but I saw the look. Over the next 2 years, I watched my son slowly rearrange himself around her. Small things, at first. He stopped coming to the neighborhood cookout we'd gone to every July for 15 years. He stopped calling me on his lunch breaks the way he used to. When I mentioned it, he said he was just busy. Maybe he was. Maybe that's all it was. Then they got engaged. Renata came to me directly, which I'll give her credit for. She sat across from me at my kitchen table and laid out what she had in mind. The venue, the guest count, the weekend in Vermont for the rehearsal dinner. It was going to cost, she said carefully, quite a bit. She'd done a budget. She slid it across the table like a business proposal. The number at the bottom was not a small number. Her parents were contributing a certain amount, she explained. But there was still a gap. "We were hoping," she said, "that you might be able to help bridge it." I looked at my son. He was looking at his hands. I thought about the co-signed loan. I thought about the 14 months of dinner and free rent. I thought about the fact that I was still driving the same car I'd bought in 2014 because I hadn't been able to justify the expense of a new one. I said yes. I said yes because he was my son, because I had spent his whole life showing up for him and I didn't know how to stop, because part of me still believed that if I kept showing up, he would too. I gave them $42,000 over the course of 8 months, not all at once, in installments as the vendors required deposits. The venue, the caterer, the florist, the photographer, the band, the block of hotel rooms for out-of-town guests, the honeymoon resort in St. Mana, Lucia, which Renata had found and Lyle had agreed to without asking me if I was comfortable covering it. I was not comfortable. I didn't say so. What I said, every time a new invoice arrived, was that I would take care of it. I had a meeting with my accountant in October. She looked at my bank statements with the expression of someone who wanted to say something but was choosing her words. She said I was drawing down reserves faster than she'd like to see. I told her my son was getting married. She nodded slowly, which is its own kind of answer. I told myself it would be worth it, that once they were married and settled, things would normalize, that Renata would warm up once I wasn't in the position of being a variable in her budget, that Lyle would come back to himself. I believed that right up until the night of the rehearsal dinner, when his fiancée laughed at me in the doorway of a venue I had paid for, and my son stood behind her holding his champagne and said absolutely nothing. I sat in my car in the parking garage for a long time. I had my phone in my hand. I thought about calling Lyle. I thought about what I would say. I thought about all the times in his life I'd let things slide because I didn't want to make it harder for him, and how each time I told myself it would be different later. I drove home. The house felt very quiet. I put my purse on the counter and sat down at the kitchen table in my good dress, and I looked at the wall for a while. I'm 63 years old. I've been managing things alone since I was 41. I know how to be quiet and keep going. That's not the same as being okay, but somewhere in that quietness, something shifted. Not anger exactly. Something cooler than anger. Something that felt, honestly, a little like clarity. I went and found the folder I kept in the filing cabinet in my office. The one with all the contracts and receipts and correspondence from the past 8 months. Every signed agreement, every vendor contact, every deposit paid, and the balance remaining. I sat down at my desk and opened my laptop. The rehearsal dinner was Friday evening. The wedding was Saturday afternoon. It was 9:47 on Friday evening. I looked at the contracts carefully. I had signed most of them directly. Renata had asked me to, because I was the one providing payment information. My name was on the agreements with the caterer, the florist, the photographer, the band. The venue contract was in Lyle's name, but the payment installments had all come from my account. The balance remaining on each contract, the final payments due the following week after the wedding, were still outstanding. I opened my email. I wrote to the caterer first. I explained that due to a family emergency, I would not be able to authorize the final payment, and I asked them to reach out to the contract holder to make alternate arrangements. I was careful and polite. I apologized for the inconvenience. I meant it. I had nothing against the caterer, then the florist, then the photographer, then the band. I did not contact the venue directly because that contract was in Lyle's name and not mine to touch. I also called the resort in St. Lucia. The honeymoon package was booked on my credit card. I told them I needed to cancel. They told me I was outside the full refund window. I said I understood and I canceled it anyway. The partial refund they offered was better than nothing. The alternative was paying for a vacation for 2 people who had just laughed me out of a rehearsal dinner. Then I closed my laptop, went and changed out of my blue dress, and made myself a cup of tea. I slept better than I had in months. The call came at 8:14 the next morning. It wasn't Lyle, it was Renata. Her voice was a different instrument than it had been the night before. Tighter, faster. The caterer called, she said. They said the final payment authorization was withdrawn. What did you do? I was quiet for a moment. I withdrew my authorization, I said. You, what? A pause. The wedding is today. I know. Are you Do you understand what you've done? We have 230 people coming. The caterer needs that payment to release the staff this morning. The florist is saying the same thing. What is wrong with you? I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. I wasn't gloating. I wasn't enjoying her panic as much as you might expect. Mostly I felt very tired and very clear. Renata, I said, last night you stood in the doorway of a venue that I paid for and told me my name wasn't on the list. And my son watched it happen and didn't say a word. I spent 8 months and more money than I can really afford on your wedding, and I wasn't important enough to include in a rehearsal dinner. Silence. I wish you both well, I said. I genuinely do. But I'm not in a position to continue funding arrangements that don't include me as a person. She started talking again, louder, faster, something about contracts and legal obligations. I'm not a lawyer, and I don't know exactly what my liability was. I told her she was welcome to consult whoever she needed to consult. Then I said goodbye and set down the phone. Lyle called 11 minutes later. I let it ring. He called 3 more times over the next 2 hours. The last voicemail was long. His voice was shaking. He said things like, "You've ruined everything and how could you do this, and I thought you were better than this." I listened to it once, then I saved it because I knew that later, when the sharp edges of all of this softened into something I could look at more clearly, I would want to remember exactly what he said in the moment he finally spoke up. The wedding happened, I learned later. Lyle and Renata sorted out enough to get through the day. I don't know all the details. I don't need to. The weeks after were strange. Quiet in a way that was different from the ordinary quiet of living alone. Lyle didn't call. Renata certainly didn't. My phone, which had rung with reminders and vendor confirmations for 8 months, was mostly silent. I started doing things I hadn't made time for. I'd had a small vegetable garden years ago, before Lyle's father died. Before the years of just getting through, I went to the nursery in late spring and bought seedlings. Tomatoes, basil, zucchini, one rosemary bush that the woman at the counter said was pretty hard to kill. I planted them on a Saturday afternoon and found that I enjoyed it in a way that surprised me. I called my friend Dolores, who I had been postponing dinners with for the better part of a year because I kept thinking I'd be less stressed soon. We had dinner at a Thai place downtown. Then we went back to her house and talked until midnight, which I haven't done since my 30s. I started going to a Saturday morning watercolor class at the community center. I had no talent and no illusions about it, but something about sitting in a room with other people who were also just trying to make something, without any agenda, felt like permission I hadn't known I needed to give myself. I thought about Lyle a lot, not always with anger, sometimes just with a kind of grief, not for him exactly, but for the version of him I'd been holding on to. The boy who used to fall asleep in the car on the way home from his baseball games and let me carry him inside, limp and trusting. The 20-year-old who'd sat across from me at the same kitchen table the week after his father's funeral and cried in a way that he hadn't since he was small. Wherever that Lyle was, I missed him, but I had spent a lot of years waiting for him to come back, and I was starting to understand that waiting wasn't the same as hoping. Waiting was just holding still while your life moved around you. I decided to stop holding still. 7 months later, Lyle called on a Sunday evening. I almost didn't answer. I'd gotten used to the quiet, but I did. He didn't start with an apology. He started with small talk, which was its own kind of apology. His voice careful and tentative in the way of someone who isn't sure what reception they're going to get. He asked how I was. He said he'd heard from someone I'd taken a trip. I had, in fact, taken a trip. 2 weeks in Portugal with Dolores and her sister, which I'd booked in February, and which had been, without exaggeration, one of the best experiences of my adult life. We walked until our feet hurt. We ate pastries, standing up. I drank wine at lunch without feeling guilty about it. "That sounds nice," Lyle said. "It was," I said. A long pause. Mom. His voice changed, dropped. I'm sorry. About the rehearsal dinner? I should have said something. I didn't, and I thought about it a lot. I didn't say anything right away. I let the silence be what it was. Why didn't you? I asked. He was quiet for a long time. Then, I don't have a good answer for that. That was honest, at least. More honest than I expected. I know things got out of hand, he said. With the money. With everything. I didn't handle it the way I should have. No, I said. You didn't. Renata and I are in counseling now, he said. I didn't ask him to elaborate, and he didn't. I'm trying to figure some things out. I told him that I was glad. I meant it. We talked for another hour. Not about the wedding, not about money, not about any of it. Just talked the way we used to. He told me his business had picked up a big commercial contract. I told him about the watercolor class and watched myself describe it with more enthusiasm than I expected. Before we hung up, he said, I'd like to come see you, if that's okay. That's okay, I said. He came the following Saturday. He brought coffee. We sat at the kitchen table, which has held a lot of our history, and I showed him the garden, which had done well that season. He told me the rosemary I planted was out of control, which made me unreasonably proud. We didn't fix everything that day. I don't think you fix years of accumulated silence in an afternoon. But we were in the same room, actually talking, and that was more than we'd had in a long time. I'm not telling you this story because it has a tidy ending. It doesn't. Not yet. Lyle and I are rebuilding something, slowly and carefully, the way you rebuild things that have to hold weight. I am not close with Renata. I don't know if I ever will be. She has never apologized to me directly, and I have stopped expecting her to. What I hope, for both of their sakes, is that whatever they're working on in that counseling room is real. What I know is this. The version of me that handed over $42,000 and sat alone at home on the night of the rehearsal dinner. She was trying so hard to matter to people who had stopped seeing her. And I understand why she did it. I was that woman for a long time, but the woman who sat at her kitchen table at 10 o'clock at night and calmly went through a folder of vendor contracts, she knew something the other woman had forgotten. That love isn't a transaction. That dignity isn't contingent on being included. That the moment you stop making yourself small to fit into someone else's space is the moment you remember how much space you were actually allowed to take up. I have a watercolor class tomorrow morning. The rosemary is officially out of control. I have dinner with Dolores next Thursday, and I have already made the reservation because I have stopped waiting until I'm less busy to have a life. I set down the clipboard. I walked back to my car. I drove home, and I started over.